Good morning, everyone. This is Rama on Writing, coming to you live from a beautiful, soon-to-be sunny Kailua, Kona, Hawaii. Well, we've had an interesting week of authors moving ahead with their projects. I think I set up 6 new formats this week, although some of them are covers first, and then we'll catch up on the interior. It may, if I think back, it may have been the busiest time, the busiest week or two that I've been part of. So we have a lot of authors moving ahead. Of course, I'm not one of those right now. So, I admire anyone that can actually get it together and get their book into the next step each week. I was doing a little bit of research this week on a topic that I'm going to address in a later webinar. I was starting to look at some of the different demographic of the different social medias. And, it does vary, but almost universally, social media is being used by a younger generation than myself. Although I think that I'm young at heart, so I like to work with a younger demographic, social media. It all seems to be a younger group. And I really thought that by understanding the demographic, we could tailor our message a little bit better for our social media. Anyway, that's a topic that I'm going to get into at a later date in time. I just truly started to think, well, who is the audience on social media? We're spending all this effort, and what is who are we connecting with? Anyway, that's as I say, for something a little bit later on. Today's topic is gonna talk about good writing and maybe good marketing as well. And Tom Carroll was the impetus for this topic. And I think it's a worthy topic because we all want our books to be good. Regardless of what we're writing about, we all want our books to be good. Some of us feel that our writing is great and others, don't. And we rely on the development of our manuscript to create that, quote, good writing. And so I think that there's a lot of different approaches. By no sense of the word do I consider myself the next Hemingway. But somewhere in this audience, we have authors that are the next Hemingway or the next, good writer. And, that's really a admirable goal. So, what is good writing? I mean, when we study writing in school, what I remember most is different passages that the teacher identified and they talked about the descriptive components of that writing. And I couldn't even list the authors that they were referring to, but they were considered the great writers of that era. And so we grew up thinking that good writing is all about description. And so I've seen some authors err on that. And when I say error, what I really mean is that they have used too much description. So I've come to the realization, and I think Tom mentioned this to me in one of the early webinars, or I picked it up from his dialogue, that good description moves the story forward. Okay, and that's the definition of good description. And I think that some of us err on the side of over description because we have in our brain that good writing is descriptive. And so we may need to evaluate each component to make sure that the writing moves the story forward. And I think that in all of our writing, we do need to address that basic understanding that whatever we write about, is it moving the story forward? And I think it's really hard for us to see this because we're so close to our topics that, we don't quite see it in the eyes of a reader or what an editor might see. So this is why we have a series of editors that look at our work and give us suggestions for development. And I've noticed that the new breed of copy editors that I have been spending more effort in trying to convey that message. It's almost to the point right now that with our copy editors, we're getting a second style evaluation, or at least we're getting some of those same kind of direction that our style evaluation worked with. And I think that that's good because, just like readers, not all editors see eye to eye on everything, and they also, some editors have a really good way of conveying what their sense is. So whether we start with good writing or whether we start with okay writing, and then as we develop the manuscript we move from okay to good, I think that tends to be our modus operandi. Now, Tom Carroll brought a quote together, and I'm going to unmute him here and see if he remembers the quote that he brought up last week, because I think that this was really an interesting quote that he's talking about. So I'm going to unmute him and see if we can get to that initial quote that he had talked about last week. You know the one that I'm talking about, Tom?
Well, I do, and let me suggest that we do something just slightly different. I want to read it's a single-page article that I had sent to you, written around that quote. Stephen King quoted. I quoted Stephen King. Many of you might know that he wrote a book for writers. So, do you mind if I just go ahead and read this whole thing?
That's fine, Tom. You're on.
All right. So, Stephen King quote, he said without his glasses, "While it is impossible to make a competent writer out of a bad writer, and while it is equally impossible to make a great writer out of a good one, it is possible with lots of hard work, dedication, and timely help to make a good writer out of a merely competent one." Well, that quote really stuck sideways in the head of a woman who I know who's writing, not part of our group. So I went on to say, with so many writers to choose from, this subject brings Ken Wilber to mind for me. And Wilber, in some of his writing, explains that he learned to write by hand copying every book ever written by Alan Watts. I don't know how many of you know Alan Watts, but he was the guy who introduced Zen to the North American continent. So who can say whether or not Wilber would have been a successful writer had he not subjected himself to this exercise, undertaking the exercise. However, reading Wilber, you encounter a disciplined mind made accessible as a result of being a good writer. Which came first, the disciple of his chosen subjects or the disciplined student of the writer's craft? A recent Facebook said, in effect, writing is something worth write something worth reading, or do something worth writing about. Here we see an important point spelled out. Good writing is merely good writing, but great writing results from a combination of skills, two of which are facility with language and mastery of a chosen subject. The challenge then is to have a damn good story and know or learn to tell it well. Murder your darlings. Attribution is murky. Some say it was Orson Welles. Whoever said it, the advice for the writer is advice for the writer to live by. The admonition being to edit ruthlessly, to delete all the clever phrases, all the lines we're sure will impress readers. Erase all traces of words and phrases employed gratuitously, all the cool stuff I've always wanted to say. The truth is that if "Make My Day," quote, "Make My Day" finds its way onto one of my pages, our pages, we probably ruined the day, certainly the experience of readers with an ounce of sophistication, reading sophistication. Unless you're very skilled, unless you're very skilled. Are you good enough to use cliche in a way that doesn't ooze pretension and scream amateur? If you think you are, if you think you're that good, well then, go ahead, make my day. The words we choose, the tones implied, the tempo employed, all the subtleties that transform raw words into situationally appropriate, emotionally convincing vehicles of thought and feeling. Not just words, but when and how we write them. If I would not speak them in a normal conversation, if my character would not say them, murder them now or suffer later as they stare back at you from a piece that found its way to publication. Material from your early years, text that you would sacrifice a finger now to be rid of as you and your writing have matured. Does each word or phrase we write serve the reader, the story? The question refers to another piece of advice. The idea is simple. Leave no trace, no evidence of ever having been in the same room with the keyboard. Think CSI, that story, that TV thing, crime scene investigation, I think it is. Wear latex gloves over both cerebral hemispheres. When we write, what we write, it's about the story, stupid. A biography is the example that breaks the rule. But if I'm not writing about myself, why should evidence of me appear on the page? Great writing is rare, and thankfully so. Were it not true, were Tolstoy, Twain, Hemingway, Huxley, a couple of others, there was more to it. But there are three ideas in here, and that is that good writing is a combination of good word usage, facility with the language, and it's also it also requires that we really have something to say, which is embodied in the idea of write a good story or do something worth writing about. So there has to be something in our writing that's genuinely interesting. We're in a world flooded with information, so you really have to stand out. You have to have a good story or be that exceptional person with words wherein what you're saying, even just the way you're saying it, catches people's attentions. And then this other part, murder your darlings. When I first heard that, it was just something that I would never forget. And the idea, of course, is that we are all victims sometimes of the urge to use a favorite cliche, a current buzz phrase. We feel cool if we too get to use it. And it's a terrible mistake. Does the writing really serve the story? Does it move the story forward? Are we using words and phrases just because we think they sound cool? Be ruthless with your editing and pare down everything that doesn't really need to be there. Now that's advice for kind of a style of writing very sparsely in a spare way, using as few words as possible. That's not always going to be the case. That's not always going to serve us, which says something else, that there is no one piece of advice, no one manual or no one's idea of good writing and what it takes to write well is going to be entirely accurate. One person can make mistakes and they're going to jump off as just absolutely glaring and ruin the story. Another person can make the same mistakes but use them in an artful way that is clever and really does serve the writing well. So there's no one rule, no hard and fast rules. Grammar actually goes out the window with a good writer. You can do everything wrong grammatically, one-word sentences, all sorts of little devices a person can use. And that gets into this thing of tone and tempo, words that you might not necessarily think of when you think about how do I write well. But the way we set up the flow of the ideas that come out of our mind and onto the page, the tempo, the flow of the ideas, the tone that we set with our words. Do our words and does our phraseology really set that tone for the dark and stormy night in a believable way? And I think there was something else in here, but the idea is that for all of this is we really need to look at our writing. Let's say it this way, I look at my writing in terms of how other good writers, established writers, would say something. If I'm writing dialogue, I think to myself, how would Michael Connelly have written this? One of my favorite authors. So not all of us do come to the page, to the keyboard with all of these talents right at our fingertips. But contrary to what Michael or what Stephen King says, I believe that if we're really studious, if we really care, if we do something similar to what Ken Wilber did, handwrite out a book, we then embody the tone and the style and some of the abilities of that person who's a proven great writer. So murder your darlings, murder your whole writing style, be ruthless, be willing to examine things with a highly critical eye, so as to get these fundamentals down. And like any talent, playing a musical instrument, playing a sport, once we've embodied the fundamentals, have moved our skill down to, to where it's, we have neural nets that will do most of this automatically. At that point, we have much more freedom to ad-lib. My advice, the advice that I've taken to heart, is that I examine what I write in light of what would the big boys and girls do? How would they do it? So anyway, that's enough for me, but I thought that might also be enough to introduce this, open it up, see what the rest of you think about good writing and whether or not it's something that can be learned. We've all read things that stink, and we've read things that, really shine. We've written things that stink, and occasionally something comes across my screen that I've written that I'm genuinely proud of. I know the difference. There are times when I'm too close to it and I can't see whether or not it's good or bad. And of course that shows up, for me, mostly it shows up in my spelling, the errors. I need somebody else to look it over. However, over time, I've learned to look at a piece and know whether at least there is good writing there once it gets cleaned up. So, topic introduced. What do the rest of you think?
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to meet you back up because I'm still getting a little bit of feedback when there are a couple of really important points here that I just want to say and reiterate, because sometimes we need to hear a few things over and over again. I think that the topic of using cliche is real important, and I've noticed that is one of the rules about writing your book blurb on the back of your book. The number one rule is don't use cliche, and it's really tempting because there's a trend, a buzz term, or something like that that might be current, and we're thinking we can ride the shirt tails of something like that. And that was one of the rules that came up over and over again, is that you can't rely on cliche. And I think that Tom really in the article, talked about the reason why, and I'm trying to put it back into my own words, and I'm struggling a little bit. And I think maybe it's the concept of being so bold that we feel that we can use a cliche and get away with it. And I'm not sure that we can at this stage in our development. And I think that that's what one of the components of the article that Tom referenced was that, hey, we have to start somewhere, and we do get our system, our style organized. We're getting noise from you, Tom. And so, we do all have to, at some point, come to, well, what is my style of writing, okay? And after you write your first book, you have an indication, you have an idea of what you do good as a writer. One of the style editors made a really clear point with James Parker that he was a good storyteller. And I think that James probably knew he was a good storyteller, but he never really embodied that in his psyche. And so now that he's a storyteller, he's I can hear the gears going in his head. Well, I can write about this story now, or I can write about that story. Or if he's bold, he can make up a story. And some of you are very bold. You're actually, bringing something to life that isn't like a part of your life. It's a lot easier, I think, to use our own experiences as our basis for writing than it is to step back and make some story up that's either science fiction, a fantasy, a novel, a murder mystery, or something like that. And it does require that we actually think through what we're doing. Well, if we're writing a memoir, essentially all we have to do is put the pieces in place and use the devices of what we consider to be good writing. And I think at this point, I'd like to just open up the forum a little bit to what some of the rest of you might consider good writing, what it means to you, and stuff like that. So if anyone has a comment about that, you can unmute yourself, or you can wave at me and I can unmute you. I'm going to I'm going to put James Parker on the spot here because I think that he's gone through a evolution in this book, and it's still really fresh. I mean, his book is published no more than a month ago, so he's still reveling in that light of completion and satisfaction. So I'm going to just put him on the spot here and see if we can get some of his words as to, James, what does good writing mean to you, and in your process, how did you apply it?
Well, that's a good question. How come you have all these good questions? I think for me, good writing is where you don't have a lot of structural problems in your sentences. Things are all fouled up and it distracts the reader. That's one of the main things. But I think that if you can just get your point across without making a mess out of it, if you can just sort of get your point across, and if you're trying to tell a story and you can tell that story without getting the reader confused. I know that's one of the things that I really have to work on is not confusing the reader, and I'll go back sometimes and read something and I'll think, what in the heck was I trying to say here? And so it doesn't get the point across. But I think for me, good writing, when I read good writing, I just enjoy reading it, and it doesn't matter what the subject is or anything. I mean, it does matter, but when I read something really good, I know it's good, and I enjoy it. And I think if you don't convey some kind of enjoyment to your reader, it's not good writing. I think a lot of us like to read because we enjoy it, and if you can't get that across, any kind of enjoyment, then your writing needs a little work, I would think.
James brings up a couple of really important points, I think. One is that being able to convey your story without confusing your readership. And that I think is one of the things that we do struggle with initially in this process. And the way I like to say that is that how do we get someone else to follow what's going on in our head? I mean, we can barely follow it ourselves, and then we try to put it on a piece of paper, put it into a book. We have to be awfully careful that we actually know what it is we're talking about. And, the other thing that James mentioned, this is really interesting, is that we kind of know good writing when we read it. We may not know why it's good writing, okay, but we can recognize it. And I think that's a real critical component. As I say, I don't consider my writing being a literary genius type of writing, but I think that I've been able to convey the story that I've wanted to write in a, very informal and readable way. And so I think that each of us have a different feeling, and we're all kind of writing in a different genre. We all obviously have different styles. And so we develop a way, and we struggle through, we put our manuscript together, and fortunately for us, we do have editors that clean up or help us clean up the obvious grammatical errors, sentence structure, wrong words, and things like that. So I think that goes back to what Tom Carroll has mentioned, that you can take a good writer and turn it into a better writing by running it through editors, running through sweeps of revision, and always having a purpose in mind as to why we're doing it. And of course, the first time through, we're kind of blindly stumbling through this process. Sure, you hear Tom Bird say, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this. Or you hear Rama say, okay, this is what needs to be done in this step of revision. And we're kind of, fumbling through, okay, somebody told me that I have to read it and check for punctuation and grammar. So we do that, even though we don't really know what punctuation and grammar, good punctuation and grammar is. We may know what bad punctuation and grammar is, but we don't necessarily know what good punctuation and grammar is. And then what Tom Carroll had mentioned, that as we get confident in our style, in our author shoes, in our our author sea legs, then we can feel comfortable with writing a one-word sentence, which may not be good Chicago style punctuation. So it's an interesting dilemma that we're faced. Now I'm going to unmute another person here, and I'm going to unmute her for a different reason. And of course, if I ever put you on the hot spot and you don't want to talk, just say so, please. I just know all of you through going through this process, that I think that we all have something that we can share. So I'm going to unmute Dolores here. And the reason I'm unmuting Dolores is that her book is, essentially done, and she's fine-tuning it at this point in time. It's moving into formatting very soon, and she's gone through a process. In addition, as I worked with Dolores, I found out that she had written a book before this one that she's published. And that is the question that I really want her to address, is how different, and what was the difference in your process between the first book and the second book? What did you learn from writing that first book that you were able to apply to the second book?
Hi, Rama. Thank you. That first book was like a time capsule for me. It was something I did under very difficult circumstances when I was living across the country back east. And I was the mother of a brand new infant, and I was missing New Mexico. So I wrote this book, and I wanted something to do. I was an at-home mother, and I thought, I've always loved to write. So it's kind of a collection of vignettes that eventually strung themselves out into a full-length novel. So when I went through this, the Tom Bird method, what I learned was I could take a more structured approach to writing, and as a result of that, I came up with a whole new, I couldn't go back to that old book. I mean, it wasn't like I wanted to rework it. It was kind of like a raw place in my psyche that I just couldn't go back there and touch. But the new book came out as it just kind of unfolded, and it came from a topic that I was interested in currently. And so I just began, to put it down. And there's some things that kind of go along with good writing that I believe that people should pay mind to. And that is, first of all, you need to have a good sense of place. Where are you writing about, and what's this place like to people, and be able to capture that for them. And the second thing is you have to have a good ear for language and dialogue, because if you're going to write a narrative, a complete narrative, it's going to have to be pretty compelling, and you have to have a lot to say, and characters won't have a voice if that's the case. And then the third thing is you have to be authentic. You can't be somebody that you're not. So you need to write from that place. I think of Tom Petz and what he's working through, and what makes his work so compelling is that he is who he is, and he tells us that, and we're with him. We can follow that with him. The same is true of James. When he talks about West Texas and all of that, it's like in New Mexico, you're there. He's painting a picture for you. He's putting you in that place. And so those are the ones I'm mostly familiar with right now. But and then you can't introduce an idea or a character unless they contribute to the story. You can't just pop people in there and in and out because they're kind of funny and interesting, and then just leave them high and dry, because it just doesn't make sense to do that. And so if your character, however, is a user of cliches, and you want to use cliches, that's a great place to put them, because this guy or this woman, if that's all she deals in, then that's something about her character. She's in character when she's using these cliches, and therefore you can use them as a technique for making that character more authentic or realistic. So those are the kinds of things I think that, that's about pretty much what I have to say about the difference between those two novels. This one kind of started from beginning to end. It was written as a contiguous piece. It wasn't a bunch of broken up pieces that I cobbled together and then tried to make sense of, which is kind of what like my first novel was like, even though at the end it had more structure than I actually realized it did, because I was threading, but I don't think I had the experience and the consciousness to do that deliberately, whereas this time I did.
Thank you, Dolores. I think that you hit on a number of really important points. And again, one of the things, and I'll use this example, okay, because I think that this expresses it so clearly. The writing, and in Dolores' case, she mentioned you can't put characters in there just for the sake of putting characters in there. You can't use description for the sake of description. And the easiest way to understand this, because I think this is something that we don't grasp initially. Otherwise, I wouldn't be bringing it up over and over again. We had an author who, and this was right at the beginning of my tenure with Tom. This gal had written it was a romance novel. It was 250,000 words, which is huge. I mean, that's probably, 4 books at least. But one of the comments of the style editor at that time was that, the style editor identified certain descriptions and certain things and recommended that the author, eliminate them. And I happened to be on the webinar that Tom was doing about that, and so he asked the author, well, give me some examples of what your what the style editor had identified. And so the gal had one example that sticks in my head, was that her main character was making the morning coffee and added extra sugar to the coffee. And so Tom asked the author, well, what's the point of that? Was that a character on a diet and this was a self-sabotaging movement, or what was the point of that little piece of description? And so the author understood, after Tom explained, that kind of example, the author really understood what the style editor was identifying. And that book published at 55,000 words. So somewhere along the line, the author was able to discern what was excess and what wasn't excess. And I think that, when we get to the point where we can discern that, that's a step towards becoming a good writer. Okay, now, on my case, I took the exact opposite. My style was based on more Spartan and crypticness. And my style editor at the time said I needed to add flesh to the characters. And, once I understood what that meant, essentially what I had done is I wrote my book for an audience that knew the situation. Okay, it's a adventure memoir. It's about a time in my life, and there are a lot of people that were part of that. And so when I sat down to write the book initially, that's what I think I saw in my mind, that this was my audience. Okay, it was a very small audience in reality, perhaps, but regardless, that was where I erred. I erred on the side of being cryptic, and so I recognized through the advice of the style editor that I just needed to add flesh to these characters and make them become real. And at that point in time, I think that my first book was a lot like Dolores's first book. It was a bunch of vignettes about memories of a time. And there, sure, it was, it had a loose structure, but I don't think it had a tight structure. And so, my standard joke about that book was that, well, I could put all the chapters in a hat and pull them out in order, and that's the way I could have structured the book. Now, of course, that was all before Tom introduced the poster board concept in the pacing of our manuscripts, and I think that is a critical component that we are blessed to have as part of our program. Okay, so I think that as we develop, we find that good writing does have a lot to do with pacing. How do we keep the author's interest? And there are lots of different devices. As I looked at how my first book unfolded and how this chapter was here and that chapter was there and this chapter and how it came about, the one thing that I noticed was, although there may not have been any rhyme or reason ultimately to the storyline, there was a rhyme or reason to the pacing. Okay, it's like when you listen to a symphony, sometimes it's very fast and sometimes it's light and airy, and it moves and it keeps the audience engaged. And that's what I noticed about some of the components of what I put together the first time, was that, oh my gosh, this says that, and then I really just changed the pacing to get into like a staccato or a faster pace component. And I realized that the result of that was that my audience didn't fall asleep. Okay, so I think that as we get better at this process, we do start to understand the pacing and the organization. Now, with the Tom Bird method, and this is real interesting, with the Tom Bird method, Tom recommends that we come in kind of cold. Okay, he doesn't recommend that we have an outline or a mind map or anything like that, although some authors take that step. Tom relies on the divine creative place of inspiration, and he relies on getting us in touch with that, and then knowing that, hey, if you're writing from that place, you're into that place of inspiration. What comes out is going to be great. Okay, and the standard joke on this, and this may be cliche, is that if we can step out of the way, if we can get the analytical mind out of the way, the manuscript will come out correctly. And I tell you, you know, I struggled and struggled and struggled with that first time around. And it really, you know, I think that we all have to learn how to move out of that analytical mind, because we think that that's where writing comes from. And Tom has shown us the exact opposite. Now, when I wrote the draft to book 2, I was in a position where I could step away and I could just let the divine inspiration kind of come through me. And if anything, I was able, through the understanding of the poster board situation and the sticky notes, I was able to start that book at an appropriate place, and by doing so, the rest flowed almost exactly as the poster board laid out. Okay, not everything was developed, mind you, but the actual flow and pacing of it came through that divine inspiration.
You know, Rama, I was listening to an interview with the artist Peter Hurd this past week, and he said something that was really interesting, that was very analogous to what you're saying about the Tom Bird method. And what he said, somebody had asked him, well, what happens when you look at a piece that you create and it's just not doing what you want it to do? It's not working out the way you want it to work out. He says, well, you look at something, and then he says, you get very disappointed that you didn't get that you haven't achieved the effect that you wanted there. He says, and when you reach the point where you're just totally wiped out by the fact that you can't seem to achieve your intention, he says, then the ego basically gives up. And then he says, the ideas come. And I thought that was very, very interesting, because that analogy fits very well with what we're doing with our writing.
You know, I once posted an article up on Facebook about drunks who were authors. I think it was the top 10 drunk authors. And these were generally thought of as, great authors. Okay, and what they did is exactly what you described. Okay, now of course they had to use alcohol to get the analytical mind to shut down and to get to that place of inspiration. And it's a great joke for us to rely on. Say, oh yeah, let's go get a drink, and then we'll really be able to write like a Kerouac or a Hunter S. Thompson or something like that, a Hemingway. But I think that ultimately Tom Bird has come up with a method that allows us to come from that place. And although at first I think we all struggle to get there, okay? In some of the early retreats, I think Bill was in one of those retreats. We had a guy with a little electronic piece of equipment. I can't think of his name. I think it was Dennis. No, it wasn't Dennis. It was, I can't remember the guy's name. Essentially, what this device did was it enabled you to know when you were in the zone. Okay, it was some kind of way of determining what brain state you were in by some alchemical thing going through your blood or your energy. And so it was kind of a cute idea.
We
And
call that voodoo science.
yeah, it was exactly something like that. The guy was all into it, and and he would let people kind of use the device, for 15 minutes at a time, and that way everyone could have a chance if they wanted to utilize it. And so you were able to have a empirical way of knowing when you were in the zone. Okay, now of course when you're in the zone, you know when you're in the zone. Okay, so you don't necessarily need that device to tell you, but sometimes the reinforcement of something like that does help, especially initially when we're struggling to move away from the analytical mind. Because ultimately what I've learned in this process is that there is somewhat of a battle going on between your left and your right brain. Okay, your analytical mind really wants to be in control of everything, and it doesn't want you to know that you could write a book without it being in control. And then that's ultimately the strong reason why when we get into the revision excuse me, when we get into the revision process, we want to also be in that same state of mind, or we will start to pick our work apart. And so, as you go through this process, when you get to those states of mind where either we can't get started or we can't follow through on something, it's best to, step away and not swim upstream. Well, let me talk to a couple other people. I'm going to unmute Amy Dean here. Amy has been working on her manuscript, and I know that the reason it's taken her this long is that she's got a comprehension of what good writing is. Okay. And that's what she's really, struggling with, because none of us want to write a book that isn't considered good writing, okay? I mean, I get that. We're all in the same place for this. Now, that may mean something different to you as it does to me, but, we're here today to kind of share some of these ideas so that it becomes easier for us to move forward. So, Amy, tell us what good writing is for you.
Well, I think it's one thing I notice in my own writing, particularly by the Tom Bird method, is that I am likely to use, in order to get things down quickly, I'm going to write things perhaps in kind of the same way, using the same words down through everything. And that is boring for a reader. You really have to kind of go through and ruthlessly examine how many times have you used said, how many times have you used, whatever the word is. So, as you have said, you need to edit. Also, sometimes you may not get everything down in that first cut that you think should be there. You don't want, I find that when I write, my initial cut on anything I write, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, is that I may end up using more words than I really need to. That I need to be prepared to simplify things down, because my first cut tends to be much more formal language, very much more grammatically correct. And that may not fit the style of the genre you're writing in, whether it's fiction or even in nonfiction, you can be writing formal versus casual. It depends on the audience, depends on your subject. Formal language and strict grammar adherence can be useful in some areas, but when you're talking about an action adventure novel, it's really maybe out of place, maybe kind of jarring in tone. So that's kind of some of the balancing that you need to do. So, and when you do use description, it needs to put the reader in the locale where your action is taking place. If it's superfluous, cut it. Be ruthless. My 2 cents.
Well, actually, you brought up some excellent points. If I think back to the way Tom Bird works with authors, okay, in the soul read, if he senses that the author's book doesn't quite have that passion that he strives for, he has the authors go through a number of exercises, not unlike the exercises for retreat prep, okay? Where he gets the author to write about the senses so that they have a grasp of what that actually means as a first step to adding that component to the manuscript, okay? So I think that that's really, in some respects, that's kind of what you're saying, is that first time through, and this is classic for an engineer, first time through, it's going to be much more mechanical for you, okay? And then you're going to look at it and you say, well, it needs to be approachable. Okay, that's a term that, that I use. It's not the term that you use, but you said the same thing. It's got to be stylized to the audience that's going to read it. And, you didn't say this, but I am going to. English language may be outdated to today's fast food world. Okay, and I think that that is something that we're all looking at, and and some stick to grammar and punctuation more than others, and we're going to get to an author that went through that, and I think that she's got some really good reasons of why she went through that process, because to her that was a real important component of her perception of good writing, or good writing for her. And of course, she knows who she is. I'm going to unmute Mary here because we've gone through this process, somewhat, belabored, but, rightfully, I understand fully what she did and why she went about it. So I want to kind of hear it in her words, because she was very passionate about wanting and needing to have this done to her manuscript, to feel that she had a good manuscript. So Mary, explain it to us in your words, because as I say, you just went through this process, and I know it was frustrating at times, but there was some, it's like this was your truth, and this is our truths too. We all have some of this in ourselves, some more than others, but kind of explain it to us a little bit. So,
okay. Well, what happened is I published my book on Amazon April 20th, and as I told my professional editor friend in Austin, whose services I should have used first and didn't, I had delusions of competency. I've always prided myself on being a really good proofreader, which I am for other people. I can catch any typo or wrong word. But my book had so many errors when we did a trade, because I gave her 2 Vedic astrology readings for her to do a one-time pass, and normally she does more than that and normally she charges a lot more. When I should show you guys, when the book came back, on the edge were these little teeny little sticker things of like, this page needs fix this. It was like a forest of changes. There were a few places where the wrong word had been used, like word instead of world, that I didn't see, my eyes didn't catch. But there were a lot of grammar things. And the copy editor, in my opinion, should have caught a lot of that. And that copy editor is no longer with us because of all the things he did not catch in my book. And so we've been going through this process of sending it back and back to the formatters so many times. It's been extremely frustrating. And I wonder, Rama, if what am I on, version 9 now? Is that the most you've ever seen a book go back to these formatter people?
No.
Good, that makes me feel better.
And I just want to add that, Mary, you're not alone in this scenario. Okay, I have a book that was published a year ago, and we just went back through a correction cycle on it because of the same reason. Grammar wasn't addressed. I want to say grammar wasn't addressed in a professional way, okay? And I think that states it all. And I do have to, give you really high marks here, because you're the one that pushed us to try something else. And as a result of the quality of what we're providing for the author, I have 2 copy editors that really are full-time at this point in time, and they are both a cut above who we were using prior. And I'm also noticing that they don't understand fully what a copy editor does, okay? The guy that did your manuscript was, trying to address only copy editing. And what I've noticed is that with these 2 editors, they're really addressing content editing as well, okay? So if they see a part of the book that they feel is not written well, they're going to identify that. They may not be able to, provide, clean or full copy edit on that section. So they're saying, hey, look, this has to be totally rewritten or taken out, or it doesn't do anything. And I haven't seen that from any of our copy editors before. So essentially what they're doing is they're providing a higher, a more comprehensive service. And I want to thank you, Mary, for pushing us to that point. Sometimes it takes time to evolve a program, and editors, I think that we truly put a lot of strain on our editors because of the volume that we run through them. And
well, I'm happy to help. And if my jumping up and down and saying this won't fly helps, that's good. But I don't want a single mistake in my book, because I come from a strong, English background, and I want to have perfection in my books. I know that even Tom's books have some misspellings in them, and I want to get somebody working on those and revising his books, because we're presenting a writing program, and we should be excellent. We should be perfect, and the finished product. That's my feeling.
I'd like to be able to agree with you, but I've yet to see a book that comes through without a single error. But the point you make is really, really important, okay? There was one person that, when talking about my book, complained about the errors rather than what the content was. And I make this joke to all of the authors that when you get your book published and you give it to your friends to read, they are really, really happy to tell you about all the errors that they find in your book, to the point where you're really wondering if they got anything out of the book other than the fact that on page 24 you used the wrong there, and and so it gets to the point where but it's important not to be criticized as the messenger And I think that that's the point that Mary really identified for her, was that she didn't want people to criticize the work because of bad grammar and errors. You know, it takes away from the credibility of the story. And I think that that's really what Mary struggled with, was that she was adamant that, hey, look, if there are too many errors in here, people will dwell on that as opposed to what I'm writing about. And she's got a great story. She's going to be up on an author interview in a couple of weeks. We have to firm up that date, and we're going to try and experiment with her on a book launch. So, you know, we're working with a book that has gone through a lot of error correction and grammar and things like that. So I think it'll be a good topic for us to play with. I'm going to move on, but I wanted to really share this experience because, and I make this joke. If you don't know me well enough yet, you'll know that I rely on humor. I'm a tongue-in-cheek humorist, and what I say about my book is that, hey, look, the style is a very informal style. Punctuation and grammar isn't as important as it is for the rest of you. Okay, but I say that. I say that because I really am trying to make a point that, hey, this is an important component for all of you. Regardless of whether I care so much about it for my book or not, you know, I recognize that this is one of the big struggles for us. And one of the things that I have learned, and this was a education to me, is that copy editing, even though it is called a Chicago-style copy edit, meaning that the protocol was developed by the Chicago Tribune, I always thought that a copy editor did the same thing. Copy editor 1 and copy editor 2 would take your manuscript and they would essentially, you know, provide you the same information. I didn't realize that that is a huge fallacy. Copy editing is a judgment as well as a protocol. So we want our copy editors to have good judgment. But, you know, one of the things that I, again, say regularly is that if you take your manuscript and send it to copy editor 1 and they come back with recommended changes, you accept all those changes, and then send it to copy editor 2, you would want to believe that copy editor 2 isn't going to have any additional changes for you to do. Well, in the real world, copy editor 2 is going to have opinions different than copy editor 1, and you're going to get as many corrections on the second copy editor as you did in the first one, and then you're going to accept those changes and you can send it to a third copy editor and encounter the same thing. Okay, so opinion plays a lot in the English language, and we do want to provide someone that's, you know, knows the protocol as well as has good sense, because sometimes you know, sometimes just a little bit of good sense can go a long way in understanding English. I don't see Ashira at her computer. I really wanted to get somebody on. There she is. Now, what I was going to say about Ashira is that, well, here's someone that thinks outside of the box, but then I thought, you know, I don't even think there's a box in the way that she addresses some of the same things that we do. So I just wanted to get a little take from her about, you know, good writing in her perspective, because I think this is going to be different than the rest of us. You know, everyone's got a different feel. So, Ashira, do you have any ideas that you would like to share?
Yeah, thank you. I was eating some chips. You want to see me eating my chips. um, they're really spicy. Woo. Anyway, peach habanero. My first thought is about the very beginning. My first thought is about the first sentence or the first word. You know, because I think that for me, that one of the most interesting things that I ever heard was how you have to grab people's attention right away. And I've been told that I'm good at that. That a lot of times that people write and you know their story doesn't really start until whatever half their story later, but they leave it in there because they don't know what to take out. So I'm just telling you that I feel that I can speak to this because I've been told that I'm good at it by other writers. So what I do, you know, I write a lot in my head, but I also keep notebooks everywhere. I have tiny little notebooks like in the thing, you know, the pocket on my door in my car, but I also have more notebooks in another place in my car, you know. So when I'm stopped somewhere, not while I'm driving or anything, but you know, like I might pull over somewhere when I get a chance and write something down. You know, I do that frequently. And I just am mentioning that. I mean, I also have like, I don't use these anymore. Actually, I used to use, before I did the Tom Bird method thing, I used to use, for a while, shower pads, like they're, you know, waterproof paper that can get wet, and with a special pencil and everything, you can use it while you're taking a bath, a shower, anything. So you just, or whatever, just have them in the bathroom, you know, for any time, you know, that you have something to write, and they can get wet and they're okay. And the reason was because I didn't want to lose a thought. But I haven't had that problem at all since I started the Tom Byrne thing. It's more like, oh my God, I just can't stop writing, you know. Things come to me all the time, but I've always written while doing other things, you know, written in my head while I might be doing gardening or anything else. And I personally think that works really well. I think it works better because if you're sitting there at a desk trying to write something, I mean, I've done that too. I used to do that a long time ago, at a desk or a table or something like that, trying to write. I find, pre-Tom Bird or without Tom Bird method anyway, I think it's difficult, you know, because you don't want, like, you're wasting time. Why are you doing that? You know what I mean? You might as well go do something interesting and then write about it. And I think that probably is part of how I grab attention, because I'm active, I'm physically active, and I think that comes through in my writing, you know. It's like, if you know, you can tell things about people by how they move, you know. So I've been told, I don't know. And you know, I've been told that I have a lot of rhythm, you know, in my writing. It might not, maybe I'm a little active and it comes across, but maybe it doesn't for everyone. But I think that like writing reflects the rest of your life. And so why I say that I write while I'm doing something else and how that relates to not writing too much and leaving out the stuff that isn't interesting and getting to the good part first, is because I'm writing it in my head. And then I wait, you know, I think, okay, there's something I want to write about, something happened, something that I find interesting. And I think thinking that something is interesting is really valuable. You have to value, or at least I find it valuable to value my own thoughts, rather than thinking like, oh, this is something that I want to talk to someone about. This is something that I want to work out. I need a friend or a family member to understand me, or I need to meet somebody new who can understand this thing that interests me, or I need to go to therapy to work it out, or I need to find some, you know, TV show that, you know, is about this. Instead of that, I'm like, no, I don't need to do any of those things. I just need to get this out to people. These are my thoughts. These thoughts that I'm having are actually, this is a poem, or this is a song, or this is a story. This is some kind of potential writing that other people could benefit from. And I think about it, you know, from what is the beginning of my thought about it, from the moment that I realize, wait a second, this is something I need to be writing about. And I think about it until I get to the point where I'm like, oh, and that's the good beginning. And then I just, in my head, before I ever write it down on paper, I chop off that whole part that isn't interesting or isn't as interesting. And I might put it later, you know, that not as interesting stuff, if it still is necessary for, in terms of understanding a certain topic, then I'll put that later, but I'll put the when the grabby part I'll put first. And I'm very, very, very careful about not reusing words unless it's something that I really like, and sometimes I just really like a word. I mean, I go through different phases, pretty regularly where a word just sounds good to me. I want to use that word. And then I might use it a bunch of times, and then I might take it out a bunch of times. And I think, and you're right, by the way, I was thinking about your thing about the box, because you had said that I think outside the box, and I was talking to my mom about that, and I was like, where is the box, And you're right about that.
Ashira, thank you for your comments. I think that you nailed one really, really, really important component. And in Tom's revision process, he has identified this as well. And so I'm glad that you brought it up because it hadn't been brought up yet. We need to engage the reader right off from the beginning. And that is a critical component, because I think many of us are brought up with the assumption that you need to lead up to a climax. You need to develop the backstory to hit to the climax, as opposed to hit the really exciting part and then step away from it with the backstory. Okay, so very, very good recommendation, gang. We need to engage the readers right from the start. And when I talk about the poster board concept, what I like to say with the first set of pinks is you have to hit them with your best shot right at the beginning. And then, of course, I look at the ending and I say, and at the ending, you have to hit them with a better shot. Okay, so these are two critical components that we need to engage the readership. So good writing engages your readership. It attracts their attention. It causes them to want to read more. And that's the puzzle that we all face. And so thank you again for bringing that up, Ashira. I knew that I could get some great comment out of you that no one else would have brought up, just because of who you are and what I know about you, which is very little. But still, it comes across enough in our conversations that, hey, we're going to get something exciting from Ashira here. Okay, now I just want to talk for one moment about the better shot at the end, because this even Tom Bird mentions this in his conversation about writing, and he says, how many of you have read a book and when you get to the ending you're disappointed? Okay, so we want to build that understanding into our process, is that, well, the ending is just as important as the beginning, because we need to leave the reader fulfilled. Okay, they have to feel that it was worth reading the book. And of course, if we're writing a sequel, you want to leave them hanging, right? If you look at all those big movies, that's how they operate. The ones with sequels, is they leave you hanging so that you want to find out what happens, and you're almost disappointed, or you're left wanting more. So, this is a critical component in how we lay out, how we do our pacing. And it would be nice to think that all this comes naturally, but unfortunately, I think that it comes through development and understanding. So, thank you, Ashira, for sharing. I think that was a critical point, and one of the most important points that we face when we are writing is that we need to engage that author right from the start. We live in a fast food society, or, my term isn't really fast food anymore. It's fast media society, okay? we expect something right at the beginning to keep us engaged. And if, as writing our story, we can't capture someone's attention, what's going to keep them reading that, the next 30,000 words or 90,000 words? How do we keep them interested? And that's a goal. To me, that's one of the critical components of good writing. Regardless of whether you have decent grammar or not, you have to engage your audience. You have to keep them interested. And initially, without understanding the poster board concept, without having that as part of our program, we lost that. Nowhere did anyone tell our group that, hey, look, you've got to engage them right from the start and keep them on the edge of their seat through the whole thing. There are times to rest and there's time to build up to the next aha moment. And so these are the pacing components that make up good writing. Okay, I'm going to meet you back up, Ashira, and I'm going to open up the form. I haven't called on everyone yet, but I'm going to call on Leland here, just because Leland works in a different genre than most of us. Leland relies on pictures as well as very few words to get his message across. And I think that that's a hugely important component for all of us, because, we, in our writing, we're painting pictures. Well, Leland has taken a shortcut. He has somebody create the images for him, and he puts the words on the page to help bring those images to life. So the question I have, Leland, is why are you writing this way? I mean, what made you decide that this was the way for you?
Well, for starters, I do have a short attention span, and that works with writing children's stories. And the inner child is very much alive in me. For example, when I was riding with my assistant driver with disabled veterans, I started to ask her, if she's a dog person, I'm a dog person, we have dog packs. If one of your dogs was driving, what kind of driver would she be? And, she definitely would be, this dog would be lead-footed, that dog would be cautious, this dog would be on the horn all the time and screaming at people. If a cop came and stopped one of my dogs, definitely there'd be a problem. Instead, the other one would be very cooperative and sheepish. So it was spinning a whole plot of if your dog were a human, but this kind of happens with me constantly. When I was in summer camp as a counselor, years ago, I would be a storyteller and loved it because there was no preparation. I just would tell the stories and do the voices. With novels, for adults, people will keep saying that the book was better than the movie. But for a children's story, if one has seen the animated versions of Dr. Seuss or Winnie the Pooh, the animated versions work perfectly, because that probably what was going on in the author's mind. He was envisioning it in a form of animation. But one of the problems I have is in getting feedback from my old college roommate. He is giving criticism that one of the illustrators is doing adult type illustrations. Well, I don't know. Is this working? Can anybody see anything?
A little bit, a little bit. Uh-huh.
For a children's story, do I see any nods of any heads? I can make out anything. Well, it really should be cutesy. And that's really what I wanted. Like, this is cutesy, if anybody can see that. Well, okay. But Karen, who has met Rama several times, I wish I could just work with her alone because we're on the same wavelength. And finding illustrators is difficult because an established children's illustrator, really established, can charge between $10,000 and $20,000 per book, which we don't have. But we know that there are starving artists out there. There must be 100 starving artists who want to get established for every established illustrator. So that is now the challenge, because I have 2 more books which need to be illustrated, and they need to be cute, adorable, that you want to hug the animals and hug the kid.
Leland, you brought up a really, really interesting point, and I haven't even gotten, I know your books intimately because I laid them out for you a number of times in this process, and it's interesting to hear. Well, these pictures are really adult pictures for a kid's book, and that's a really astute, concept. I mean, I would never have thought of that and put that into words. And I can see that this was something that you learned in this process. Okay, so you learned a big lesson here in what works for you, but the most important thing that you said, Leland, is I don't have a very long attention span, okay? And I think that is something that we all work with, and that's why initially you have to hit them with the best shot right at the beginning of our novels or memoirs or self-help book, because we have to capture that attention span, and we only have a moment to do that. So again, great points there, Leland. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm looking for that. I'm looking forward to the book that you described. If dogs could drive. I was like, oh my gosh, I saw the book. As you described, I said, oh my gosh, it's a great book.
I've written one that Karen's going to illustrate. Why do dogs bark?
Oh, good.
And kids will identify with that originally when I do readings. Then I'll ask them, do you have dogs? But do you know any dogs? Does your neighbor have any dogs? You wonder, then they can follow along and hope their heads nod that they know that in this and that situation, that's why their dog is barking. August 22nd, I'm going with Karen to the Tomato Festival in Kirsten, Indiana, to do a book signing at the local authors area. That is kind of a major breakthrough because there will be thousands of people. I know I live in a flyover state, people in Manhattan, LA, Tomato Festival, but it's important in the heartland.
Well, don't forget to bring your dog.
Yeah.
She'll be the celebrity. I remember one time I went to a car rally and I brought my dog, and the dog sat in the back seat, and I think he got more attention than the car did. So use your pets effectively, since that's one of your main topics there. I'd like to just kind of begin ending this conversation with a important component. And the way I'm going to address that is this way. Is having good writing enough to be successful? Okay, because I truly believe that all of us strive for good writing. Means different things to all of us. My good writing is different than Tom Carroll's, which is different than Amy Dean's, which is different from Mary and James and Shira and all. And I think that we have to accept this component, that good writing is something that we all strive for, and it does give us personal pride. Good marketing is what's going to lead to financial success for our book. And I mentioned financial success because this is an issue that I have. I generally prefer to live on the low end of life, and writing my book and having it out there and having people tell me that they love the book, it made them laugh, they captured an era that they had forgotten, is quite satisfying. It does let me know that I was successful with the point of my book. But is that enough for all of us? We've invested, $5,000-$6,000 in developing our book from nothing to a print version, ebook version of our book. Most of us are going to want to make back our money plus. So, gang, even though we may not be marketers now, we are writers. If we have our book, we're authors, we have the book done. The next step for us is to become good marketers. And that takes a lot. And, Ashira did mention something that really is an important component of marketing. And she didn't do it from that perspective. But marketing relies on capturing those ideas as they come, because we don't know when they're really going to come. And having those paths available can be a huge critical component to developing marketing ideas that work. So what makes good marketing? Tom Pitts has an answer to that question. Okay. Tom, you're unmuted. What makes good marketing?
Book number 2 and book number 3.
What a great answer. Thank you for that.
How are you going to, you can't be I'm thinking of financial success without a couple more books. And I don't think you can become the writer, the best writer that's in you, unless you write that second and third book. Try to get all the grammar right and everything right, and good storyline in the first book. It's just too much to bite off, Do that second book, you start to understand, now I understand how that pacing works. In the third book, now I understand this so much better. So that's my 2 cents. I'm getting out of that go to the this is the long run. That's my I'm getting ready for the next phase, which is going to take a year or 2.
Tom, thank you for sharing that. The one thing that I've read over and over and over again about what you can do, what's the best thing that you can do to promote book number 1 is to write book number 2. Okay, it's still not enough, but it is an important step. And I think of it as economies of scale. If I'm going to spend X amount of time marketing my book, if I have 3 books that I'm marketing at the same time, I'm going to get a bigger bang for my time. Okay, that's just, obvious economics. So very important component. And although I've shared this a number of times with authors, much to their chagrin, I think that Tom did explain this, that he didn't say it this way, but I will. I'm a blunt sort of guy. The first book is not going to be your best book, okay? And that's hard to swallow. It really is, because we're all perfectionists, and we all feel that we can that first book is going to be great. But I think that we do learn along the way about our sea legs, our rider legs, our author shoes, however you want to put it. I kind of like the author shoes. That's a Rama cliche, by the way. But I think that it is a development process, and I think that even with kids' book, Leland learned that, oh my gosh, this author made adult pictures for a kids' book. Well, that's he's going to make sure not to make that same error next time. I mean, he learned a huge lesson. And it's so clear in his head, then the way he explained it. I mean, it's just like, oh my gosh, that was such clarity. I wish that all of us could have that same amount of clarity in, working in our books. I think that, as we write book 2, we definitely learned a lot of information. We made a lot of mistakes in book 1. Book 2, we don't make those same mistakes, but we make a whole host of new ones. Ultimately, I think that we gain confidence in the process. And I think that goes a long way for us individually to progress on good writing. But again, I'll go back to book 2 and book 3 are great. We need those. But we also need to figure out, how do we market? What is successful marketing? How do we become successful? Isn't there a formula online that we can follow and become successful? Yeah, everyone's got a formula for you to follow, and you can follow their formula by spending $249 or $97 or whatever it is, and that's guaranteed to be the best approach that you can take, and you'll be successful. Well, unfortunately, I truly think that we're all struggling to find the formula that works for us. And the one thing that I have found that cuts through all the authors that I have worked with is this: we never know which action that we take will bring the most success to our project, okay? I have seen this over and over again. My biggest success probably is getting a review in a mountain bike magazine. And I didn't send my book to the mountain bike magazine. The one that I sent my book to, I didn't even hear back. I was relying on an old friend to at least comment. I don't even know if he got the thing, right? But they said he got it, but no comment. And in my case, I was sending a book to somebody else, to another author, who ended up by sending the book on to her nephew, who happened to be a mountain bike magazine editor. And the next thing I know, one of my friends is telling me that, hey, Rama, you've got a quarter page in this magazine reviewing your book. So what that really means, gang, is that we have to take a broad-based approach to marketing, okay? There are certain steps, rules, things that we do, but the likelihood of us stumbling on success immediately is fairly minimal. And we're going to stumble on our successes backdoor wise. It's going to happen, but it's not going to necessarily happen in a concerted way. So, as I say, that means that we have to take this broad view approach, and we have to do a lot of different things. and continue to do a lot of different things. From what I've read, the number one thing to do is what Tom Pitts mentioned: write book 2, write book 3. The other very important component that I've heard is that we need to have 20 to 50 blogs out there about whatever, identifying who we are, sharing our interest, sharing our sincerity, sharing our, our dark side, whatever we want to share. Getting that body of writing out there into the webosphere is a critical component, okay? Now, if you've been on the past 2 webinars, you'll also remember that Rama's been talking about hashtags, okay? Blogs and hashtags go together. Now, I talked to Greg about this the other day, and he said, well, I don't see that many hashtags in blogs. Well, he's not living the same world that I'm living. I see them all the time in blogs as a sign-off at the end of the email. So I prepped Greg, who I said, Greg, keep your eye on this. What you're going to find is that all searches are going to be hashtag searches over time. It's going to grow and grow and grow. Okay, so blogs, writing the second, third books. What else? Having our presence on social media. We're going to get into, as I started this webinar, I said, look, I'm doing a study on the demographics of social media. Well, Leland writes kids' books. How is he going to get in touch with kids or parents of kids through social media? His approach is going to have to be different than Bill Murphy's approach, and Tom Pitts and myself and Mary and James and Tom Carroll. So we all are going to need to look at social media. It's going to help us to know who the heck we're actually communicating with. Okay, because I truly don't think that any of us appreciate this yet. I know I don't. But, experimentation is the answer. This summer, I moved away from my continual fetish with Facebook, and I rarely look at Facebook anymore. I'm an Instagram person now, okay? Well, I don't know what it's happening, whether it'll pan out to do anything. I truly don't, but I know that by experimenting with it, I'm going to develop a presence. And, it does take a concerted effort working with social media, different types of social media, to find out what works for you. And as I say, the demographic is the telling tale. I found out that there's a social media called Snapshot that is virtually all younger women. And I have authors that write for younger women, and they're not on Snapshot. Well, heck, I learned something through my demographic study. Right off the bat, and I have an author who I'll be talking to about this coming week, because I found it out this week, and that's her audience, that's her demographic. So as we look for our place in the social media world, the demographic research can help us. And what we can perhaps start to see is that, well, look, I can repackage the same post from this social media to that social media, but I may need to twist it a little bit because of the demographic out there. I am an advocate of repackaging everything. So this is a strategy that I'm going to be looking at in the future. Before we sign off, we've actually almost gone through 2 hours of talk on good writing, and I want to thank Tom Carroll for introducing this subject, because I think we've all learned a little bit about what we can do to make our writing process just a little bit better. But does anyone else have any comments about good marketing? Any ideas that they'd like to share? We can certainly address this with more, with another webinar, because as I say, marketing is definitely a critical component. I like to say this: if you and I both wrote the same book and your book was written good and my book was written poorly, would your books outsell mine? We'd like to believe, if everything else is equal, that the good writing book would outsell the poorly written book. But if the poorly written book had a strong marketing plan behind it, it would ultimately outsell the good writing. So which is more important? They're both more important. Shira.
Yeah, I have a thought about it's not a complete thought, but I'm just going to share it because, otherwise we'll all be gone by the time I think of what I want to say. I wish I didn't give away this book. Now, I wish I still had it, but in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that I didn't finish reading it, but I read much of that book. I think it's towards the beginning. He talks about how he met somebody with an MFA or whatever, and she's writing and blah, 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 and, not making any money and not selling anything. He offered her some advice. She didn't want it because she figured he's not a good writer. But he said, I never said I was a good writer. I said I was a best-selling, not a best writing author, but a best-selling author. So I guess it depends on who you are and what your perspective is. If you want to advance good writing, I guess good writing is important, but it isn't for everybody.
That's the bucket list component that Ashira has mentioned. Some of us wanted to write a book just so that we can share that component. I've published books for authors that were family, for the family, and that's it. Not anything else. So then you don't necessarily have to spend your time on marketing because you've accomplished your goal. Tom Pitts, let me unmute you. You've got your hand up. Okay, Tom, you're on.
Well, this being a good writer in marketing, it kind of does dovetail, because I'm finding a well-written blog or even just a well-written Facebook or Instagram post is really important, especially that first phrase, not even the first sentence, the first phrase has to engage me. And if I read on, it better satisfy the promise that first phrase or sentence gave. And then at the end, I want something more. And I think writing a good Facebook post, a good blog, is really good practice for writing a good novel. I mean, you're really honing your skills, and everything that goes into that blog is just a miniature book. The grabber, the pace, fulfill the promise, boom. So I'm beginning to appreciate blogging a little more and writing a good one.
Tom, thanks for that. You wouldn't be the first author that has written a book through blog postings. It is a great way of sharing, our ideas. And I have, two authors come to mind that actually basically cut and pasted blog postings into their book as part of the way the book was structured. So, I don't think that they initially, when they were writing that blog, they initially were intentioned to do that. But not to say that we can't have that intention as we write those blogs. Well, everybody, I love the way the Car Talk ends their shows. You've whittled away another 2 hours of your Saturday listening to authors talk about crazy things. But as I say, I think that this was a great topic. Any other authors have topics that they'd like to have addressed on a Saturday webinar, please email me. I am always open to ideas. Sometimes I don't come up with an idea until the last minute, and then you can tell because have no prep at all to do it, and we kind of just rely on, well, I'll make Bill Murphy talk. He's got ideas, and today, we kind of got Tom Carroll to get the ball rolling, and I wanted to thank him again for that idea. Now, Tom and I talked a little bit ahead of the webinar, and he is working on a presentation for some radio shows, and I'm going to try to encourage him to maybe do that similar kind of presentation as a trial for us so that he can get better at it and, gain confidence in what he's doing. So that's something that I hope to have in the next few weeks up there. We have Mary Stevenson's interview that we're going to have on. I haven't scheduled it in yet, but I'm thinking that it will be the 22nd of August, which will be my first Rama on writing back from Sedona. So we'll tie that in with a Sedona author. Everyone, enjoy your Saturday. Have fun. Write some on your book. Write a blog. Post on Instagram. Take a picture and have fun. Take care. Thanks for tuning in.